Hello, we're back to continue with our reading of Learning to Fall, The Blessings of an Imperfect Life, with a good hot cup of tea and a couple of dogs walking around. So there again is our book by Philip Simmons, and chapter 7, which we've now reached, is called Mud Season. I undertook my first road improvement project at age 6 or 7, removing the pebbles from the dirt road in front of our house. It was the work of an idle summer afternoon. I dug stones out of packed dirt and flung them into a field. I felt I was acting for the general welfare and planned on telling my parents that evening at dinner about the good I'd done in smoothing the road. But then my father came out and told me to stop. We needed those stones in the road, he told me. This made no sense. Wasn't it better to make the road smooth? No, he explained, the stones made the road hard. We needed a hard road more than a smooth one. It took me many years to understand what my father meant. In some ways, I'm still learning. There's geology to consider. New Hampshire is the granite state, and at bottom our town is a rumpled bed of stones scoured clean by glaciers that withdrew only 10,000 years ago. Ice still haunts us. You can hike into these mountains in the heat of summer, peer into a deep stone crevice, and find it there, pale and dirty, its chill breath seeming to whisper all we'll ever know of endurance. I was, I am, I will be. The prolonged violence of the glaciers melting notched our valleys and piled up gravel, those round river stones I spent a childhood summer afternoon flinging into the field. After the melt, life took hold, and eventually trees, but 100 centuries of death and resurrection have yielded only a meager soil, laid like a thin sponge over that unyielding granite bed. With the March thaw, that sponge sops full. Streams gush, swamps rise, bogs flush, forest hollows fill with vernal pools. For several weeks, with snow still knee-deep in shadowed woods and on the north sides of buildings, we live in a between time, neither winter nor spring. No hymns are written in its praise. It's a time of neither here nor there, a non-season when, as T.S. Eliot wrote, between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. The literal sap quivers in the maples, drawn off in buckets and boiled for syrup, but this is the season's only sweetness. Mostly, it's the season of mud. In March and early April in our town, over 70 miles of dirt roads turned to mud, and most of our driveways too. Paved roads are too expensive for us. We are simply too few and far-flung. And paved driveways are shunned as being too suburban, even by those who can afford them. Our road agent patrols with the town's police chief posting day-glow signs declaring some roads officially closed owing to mud. In theory, that's to save the town crews the trouble of rescuing vehicles sunk to their axles, though every year they have to haul a few out anyway. Mud coats the flanks of our cars, splatters our clothes, cakes our shoes. Children here, of course, are mud connoisseurs. In their school art classes, my kids are handed sponges and brown paint and told to do paintings of mud. After school, I meet them where the bus drops them off on the paved state road, and we walk home through the real thing. We stomp and squish, we poke and stir, we sample textures and colors. Sometimes it takes us nearly an hour to walk the quarter mile. Children, so much closer to the source of life, seem in touch with their muddy origins. From dust you came, the priest used to tell me, thumbing my forehead with ashes. Dust, yes, but for there to be life, you have to add water, and we know what that makes. Mud even figures in our architecture. Houses here have an entire room devoted to it. When we finally reach home, my children and I leave boots and coats in the mud room. and sometimes pants and socks too, so that we often enter our dwelling half naked but mud-free. Except for the dog, who doesn't understand mudrooms and must be chased down with the towel we keep by the door. Mud season brings portents. Buds swell. Already a blush appears in the red maples above the swamp. Daffodils poke up from the earth, only to be buried by a late snowfall. A coyote limps across our field in full day. Jesus rides a donkey into Jerusalem, knowing that men wait there to kill him. Our minds cannot grasp the coming change. In 3 months, I'll plunge my body into the same lake I walked across only weeks ago. Mostly we fear it, this loosening of winter's hold, the shedding of ice certainties. We fear this time of year not so much for where it's taking us, the spring bloom and summer roar, but for what we have to go through to get there. We've all heard that Christmas is the busiest season for suicides, but I've heard that in New England, it's mud season. Mud stirs dangerous longings and reminds us of all we prefer to forget. The entire direction of civilization is away from mud. We measure our progress with pavement. The modern city or suburb with its paved streets and sidewalks, its curbs and storm drains, is really a giant mud avoidance system designed at great expense to lift us into higher and drier versions of ourselves. The word pavement derives from the Latin pavere, to stamp or beat. And indeed, we try to beat down our muddy origins and muddy selves, to suppress all things untoward and unseemly, to make our way smooth. But here in March, on roads laid more lightly over the land, pavement heaves and buckles, as though after winter's iron months, a terrible secret strains to surface. We all, of course, go through personal mud seasons, and these can occur at any time of year. We suffer illness and depression, the loss of loved ones, failed or failing marriages, crises of faith in ourselves, in others, in our gods. But personal mud seasons need not be brought on by things so great as these. Humans have a peculiar talent for misery, and lacking big reasons for unhappiness, we make ingenious use of small ones, all the bounced check and runny nose occasions of woe. We need the mud, it seems, for our mud seasons give us the pleasure of self-pity, which for most of us ranks between bowling and sex. Now, my illness weakens certain parts of the body, but not others, and I'm sorry to say I've had to give up bowling. I guess that's okay. Though sex doesn't last as long as bowling, you can do it without having to rent funny shoes. Still, having given up certain pleasures, I must pursue the ones that remain to me more often, including the pleasure of self-pity. I've needed mud more than ever, and a fatal illness offers the advantage of keeping mud close at hand. A few short, wobbly steps have me wallowing. But it's been 5 years now, and as a source of mud, my illness has lost its freshness. Even the glamour of tragedy wears thin, and I must fall back on the ordinary, everyday returns to mud we all so much depend on. My computer crashes, the dog chews the windowsill, my children cut each other's hair with poultry shears, my wife fails to appreciate my talent for staring out the window at the bird feeder. Mud, mud, mud. I've learned, though, that our need for mud goes much deeper than our need to pity ourselves. We need the mud for what grows from it. Every mud season is a kind of death with resurrection lying on the other side. In the mud painting my daughter did at school, the great brown swath across the bottom 2/3 of the paper is topped with tiny, bright flowers. The image suggests causality. Mud makes flowers, but also necessity. No mud, no flowers. As I enter my various mud seasons, I've learned to ask, What death is this? Or what is it within me that needs to die? And out of this death, what resurrection will come? My thoughts return to that Jewish peasant riding a borrowed donkey into Jerusalem the week before Passover. Reading the people laid branches and spread their cloaks on the road before him, the New Englander can conclude only one thing. He was riding through mud. What can this man teach me about going through the mud, about dying and being raised up? There's so much the nuns never taught me. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention, but it seems I had to grow to adulthood to figure out that Christ wasn't a last name like Harper or Hassan, but a descriptive title. Jesus the Christ. Jesus the Anointed One. Anointed in what sense? For answers to this question, I've been turning lately to voices I didn't hear in childhood. In recent years, the work of such biblical scholars as John Crossan and Marcus Borg had taught us much about the historical Jesus, including the political and social context of his teachings and actions. Their work has also helped me get a feel for Jesus as a man. The Jesus of my childhood was a willowy, doe-eyed figure who spent too much time in his bathrobe. I liked his ideas. Turning the other cheek and loving your enemy seemed both difficult and deeply right. But Jesus himself was strange and unappealing. I was told that he loved me and that I should love him back. But for a child, love lies close to the skin, a matter of texture and heat. My father's scratchy face, my mother's soft arms. I didn't see how I could love someone so remote as this Jesus in heaven. It was through reading literature that I eventually learned to love people I had never met, and who may not even have existed. We call these people characters, and I think I know enough of Jesus now to see him as a great character in the most dramatic of situations. The scene is Jerusalem, a Jewish city under a brutal Roman occupation. It's the week before Passover, and for days Jewish peasants have streamed into the city from the surrounding countryside, preparing to celebrate at the temple. Their presence makes the Roman authorities nervous. Recent years have seen a string of apocalyptic prophets leading peasant uprisings. The Romans have had to kill them and their followers by the thousands. Now word is out that another troublemaker, this man, Jesus from Galilee, is on his way. There's a buzz among the peasants thronging the temple precincts. The Roman authorities and their collaborators among the city's Jewish aristocracy, including the scribes and Pharisees, can only watch and wait for their moment. And here comes Jesus, astride his donkey, slogging through mud, with a crowd of followers around him and more people coming out to meet him on the road. In my version, the 12 disciples are men under those robes, and Jesus has chest hair. But there are women too. Mary Magdalene, a person of high spiritual attainment, walks confidently at his side. People are calling out to him on every side, prayers, praise, requests for healing. Jesus knows the Pharisees among the crowd are watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up. He knows they would just as soon see him dead. Then some of the Pharisees, alarmed by the crowd's enthusiasm, call out, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." At this point, a lesser man would make some ingratiating or politic reply. But Jesus answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Now, this is a man I can love. I imagine him speaking these words not with haughtiness or pride, but out of a calm conviction of the rightness of his actions. In mud season, all the land cries out the coming change. And Jesus felt himself so aligned with the natural and cosmic order that the very stones would cry out his arrival. Jesus, at this moment, is in the state of true wildness, when we express our divine natures as effortlessly as animals do, when our every word and deed flows directly from our highest purposes. It's in this same state of wildness that he later clears the temple and ultimately goes to his death. How would this world be transformed if we could all go to our deaths with such clarity of conviction? How would my life be transformed if I could go to my death in such sure faith? What new life would wake within me if I could slog through the mud of my passage here, through my great trials and everyday afflictions, with the grace and courage of this man? Wishing that we could live like Jesus may be too much to ask. On most days, if I manage to keep my shirt tucked in and refrain from kicking the dog, I figure I've made my spiritual progress for the day. And when we do hanker for moral uplift, we know it's easier to seek inspiration from men and women nearer to us. In our schools, we justly celebrate the lives of such secular saints as Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King Jr., figures less problematic because certifiably mortal. True religion is an activity of the imagination, and perhaps Jesus remains impossible to imagine afresh, buried as he is beneath centuries of cultural myth and the accumulated debris of our religious upbringings. Christian or not, happy or not. But as someone who wandered from his Catholic upbringing to follow other paths, Buddhist and Hindu spiritual practices, intramural basketball, and reading poetry while drinking cafe latte, I find myself returning by odd and circuitous routes to this dual figure of Jesus the man and Jesus the Christ. And hard as it may be, if I want to love Jesus the man, the peasant revolutionary, and visionary radical, I must also come to terms with Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Anointed One, a figure who is something more than a man. But how to do this? Again, I listen for voices I didn't hear in my childhood. For example, I rediscovered Jesus in the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama of Tibet, who recognizes Jesus either as a fully enlightened being or as a bodhisattva, a person of high spiritual attainment who has chosen to remain in the cycle of birth and death to help others find their way to enlightenment. See the Good Heart, a Buddhist perspective on the teachings of Jesus. I rediscovered Jesus as the man Islamic people revere as a great prophet and saint, and as the mysterious and powerful figure who rides through the poems of the great Sufi mystic Jalal al-Din Rumi. I rediscovered Jesus in the writings of the medieval Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, who, if asked whether Jesus was God's only begotten Son, would answer, "Yes, and so am I, and so are you." Hearing these and other voices, I imagine Jesus the man as one of God's many embodiments in the world, and I imagine Jesus the Christ as that potential divinity within each of us. When we enter into that which is divine within us, we enter our own Christhood, our own Christ consciousness. To stand fully within that presence, to live and move in such alignment with the divine and natural order, that the very stones would shout out our arrival, is to enter our highest anointed selves. And what New Testament tradition describes as Jesus' resurrection and return to the Father represents for us the possibility of a return to God, by whatever name we choose to call it, the higher self, Brahman, the ground of being. This is heady stuff, I know. For most of us, a mystical experience consists of finding a parking space with time left on the meter. For much of my life, I've lived contentedly by a few simple rules. Don't track mud in the house. Take care of your own. Help others. Do as little harm as you can. Change your oil every 3,000 miles. But maybe enlightenment is simpler than we think. I've been told that religion boils down to two beliefs. First, that there is something of ultimate significance in the universe. Second, that there is a way of being connected to it. Each of the world's religions offers a distinct way of connecting, and each of us must find his or her own way into ultimate significance. Prayers, meditation, and selfless service are all honored methods. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has taught me that, if done right, washing dishes can serve as well. We also touch the divine through our experience of nature, and in spring we celebrate the divine power of rebirth and renewal. Already the phoebes, after a journey unimaginable to me, have returned to their nest under the eaves outside my bedroom window. Their presence renews my faith in the world's extraordinary competence, its talent for winning against long odds. I breathe in the odor of wet earth and pines, as though my sense of smell were being restored to me. All about us, roots grip down and awaken, sprouts nudge toward light and air. Everywhere the earth staggers to life. And yet the example of Jesus and the experience of mud season also remind me of a harsher truth. To be reborn, we first must die. The way to Jerusalem lies through mud. Dying, like mud, can take many forms, but every death, in the sense I mean, is a letting go. We let go of ambition, of pride, of ego. We let go of relationships, of perfect health, of loved ones who go before us to their own deaths. We let go of insisting that the world be a certain way. Letting go of any of these things can seem the failure of every design, the loss of every cherished hope. But in letting them go, we may also let go fear. Let go our white-knuckled grip on a life that never seems to meet our expectations. Let go of our anguished hold on smaller selves our spirits have outgrown. We may feel at times that we have to let go of life itself, only to find ourselves in a new one, freer, roomier, more joyful than we could have imagined. We need not believe that Jesus rose bodily from the dead to grasp the spiritual significance of such a resurrection. In one of the Gnostic Gospels discovered at Nag Hammadi, an early Christian ridicules those who take the resurrection literally, saying instead that they must, quote, receive the resurrection while they live, end quote. Another 2nd century Gnostic writer asks, quote, why do you not examine your own self and see that you have arisen, end quote, from Elaine Pagel's The Gnostic Gospels. For much of my life, I've been like the man in one of Rumi's poems, asleep indoors when a friend calls him out, saying that the mystics are gathering in the street. The sleeping man offers the excuse that he's sick, but his friend says, I don't care if you're dead. Jesus is here, and he wants to resurrect somebody. In my case, it took more than a friend shouting from the doorway to get me out of bed and into the street. It took the combined wisdom of several Harvard-trained neurologists to make me see that I needed to get up. Before my illness, I, like everyone, had always spent much of my time in the mud, only I didn't know to value it. Mud seemed only to block my way. I had spent my life in pursuit of knowledge and happiness, only to find that both were overrated. For what is knowledge without faith? And what is happiness without sorrow? The path to resurrection lies through the mud, because only through pain and sorrow do we grasp the necessary truth offered in the 90th Psalm, rendered so beautifully by Stephen Mitchell. You return our bodies to the dust and snuff out our lives like a candle flame. You hurry us away, we vanish as suddenly as the grass. In the morning it shoots up and flourishes. In the evening it wilts and dies. For our life dissolves like a vision and fades into air like a cloud. In the time it has taken me to write this essay, we in our part of New Hampshire have gone through an early thaw, with bare ground showing on the southern slopes of the fields, through a week of single-digit temperatures, through another week of thaw and mud, through a blizzard that buried our hopes beneath a foot of snow, through a stretch of freakish 70-degree days in which snow vanished by the hour, and at last to gray days of cold rain. All this has reminded me of two things. The path to resurrection will be unpredictable, and we will have a hard time choosing the right footwear. Lately, my daughter and I have come to an understanding. She wears her winter boots to school, but upon her return, I meet her at the bus with her springtime rubber ones. She sits on a snowbank to pull them on, and then we stomp home through the mud. Mud is good exercise, she says, searching for mud of just the right consistency to suck one boot off her foot. My father taught me to leave the stones in the road, to be prepared for mud. And now my children are learning from their father something about walking through it. They, in return, show me what spirit can be brought to the exercise. All of us, young and old, soon and late, find our way to the mud, the season of our terrible and certain joy. Let us bring to it all the spirit we can muster. That's chapter 7, Mud Season. From Learning to Fall, The Blessings of an Imperfect Life by Philip Simmons.